you think all who cook would be better off by understanding how umami works?
Well, I think if you cook not just because you have to, but because you want to make something nice for yourself or for other people, I think there's really no substitute for understanding the basics of flavor and what it is that makes a food tasty and how to make things tastier. And umami is certainly a part of that. I mean, I think any of us would say it's important to know the difference between enough salt and too much salt, or enough tartness and too much tartness. And I think the same is absolutely true of umami. I guess with the distinction that in the case of umami, it's not such a clear boundary. It's easy for two people to agree that a food is too salty. Umami is a more subtle quality. It's really important, but it's more in the background.
So I learned or first became aware of, well, you and your book when I was a chemistry student, undergraduate, and I started hearing and learning about people like Heston Blumenthal and Ferran Adria. And, people often associate, that kind of world with a quite rigorous, strongly frameworked approach to cooking. Obviously, lots of home cooks have this much more intuitive, throw something in and see what happens approach to cooking. Have you got any suggestions for those more sort of intuition-led cooks about how they can, get more out of umami?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is simply to pay attention to flavor. Umami is a part of an overall experience, and it's important for the sake of the overall experience. So I think you want to begin simply by paying attention to flavor, and to taste things and to see how the flavors change as you cook something. I mean, the easiest example would be something like a stew or a soup. If you're grilling something, then it's kind of not done or done. But with something like a stew or a soup, you can really follow along as it develops over the course of a couple of hours and see how it changes. In fact, that's one of the things I really love about making a meat stock. I'll roast a chicken and then I'll take the bones and put them in a pot with some water and a couple of vegetables, and I'll cook those bones gently for a couple of hours, and then take out the bones and vegetables and reduce it down. And the flavor is changing constantly, and it's just a lot of fun to follow that evolution from water that tastes just like water to a nice chicken broth to a really concentrated kind of consomme sort of flavor, all simply by putting a pot on the stove and applying heat and letting time take its course.
You clearly know lots about the science that underpins food and flavor. As a cook yourself, and I'm presuming here that you do cook, you cook a fair bit. Do you switch into thinking about that? Is it sort of ever present, this idea of like, these molecules or cascades of reactions are at play when I'm doing this? Or how does that work for you when you're cooking at home?
Well, I guess when I'm cooking at home, I tend to pay attention more to what you a few minutes ago called the poetry of cooking and of food in general, which is to say the pleasure of enjoying a meaningful experience. So I do have all that information kind of in the back of my head, but what's really in front of me is the food that I'm cooking. And I'm taking in the smells as they develop, and I'm enjoying the tastes as I sample it as it goes along. The room fills with the aromas. You can hear the sound of the various processes. That's all for me, just a really rich experience. And if something happens to catch my attention, then my brain might go in the direction of trying to remember what it is that's responsible for that particular aspect. But otherwise, I'm just kind of taking it in and enjoying the whole thing.
Could you talk a little bit about how, umami relates to fermentation and, maybe its role in food waste, or how we could, extract more umami from the things that people tend to throw away?
The wonderful thing about umami is that it's generated by components of foods that are in the parts that we throw away, as well as the parts that we prize and celebrate. So one way to make use of the materials that we can't otherwise prize and celebrate is to put them in a pot and let the microbial world have the benefit of those nutrients. In the process, they break down the complex molecules in those food leftovers and generate the small molecules that we can detect as umami. And because umami is an aspect of flavor that enhances and gives another dimension to all kinds of foods, having that savory backbone in a fermented food then means that you can use that for all kinds of purposes. Of course, in Japanese cooking, things like miso and soy sauce have been for millennia important sources of umami above everything else. And what we would really be doing is taking that basic idea and applying it to materials that haven't been used for that purpose before, but that can serve that purpose just as well as soybeans.
Are there any things that viewers at home might be throwing away where there's lots of umami hiding, do you think?
That's a good question. I also have to kind of imagine other people's kitchens because I know my kitchen very well, but I don't really know what other people do. But trimmings of all kinds. If you're cooking cabbage and you take off the outer leaves because they're a little dinged up and you just don't want to include them, well, there's plenty there. In fact, they're probably richer in umami because when they're on the outer surface, they're going to dry out a little bit. And that means that everything that's in there is going to get a little more concentrated. So it might not be the most aesthetically pleasing to the sight, but for the tongue, it may be a wonderful source of flavor.
So maybe throwing those cabbage leaves into your chicken stock, that would create an absolute symphony of umami.
Yes.
Brilliant. So I mean, you first released this book in 1984, and I think it's seen various revisions since. Are you working on any other particular works at the minute that you'd like to share with us or talk about?
Well, actually, I'm revising that book on food and cooking because it's been 20 years since the last revision. We've learned a lot about food and umami since then, and so I'm looking forward to bringing it up to date.
Wow. And I'm sure lots of things have changed and you're busy doing lots of revisions because the science has developed so much. But are there any like one or two particular highlights that maybe relate to umami, maybe not, that you're most excited about adding into the original text or changing?
Well, it's really taking advantage of the fact that the science of food has become a respectable subject. You know, back in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, the science of food and cooking was not considered by scientists a particularly respectable pursuit. And that has changed very happily. I mean, what could be more important than understanding the materials that keep us alive and give us some of the deepest pleasures in our lives? So finally, the scientists have come around to seeing that this is a fascinating area, that there's a lot of really basic science to understand. These are materials that are they're every day. We take them for granted. We chop them and boil them and things like that. But when you really begin to look into them, there's a lot there that we're only beginning to understand. And flavor is an important aspect of that. You know, we now have the means to analyze tastes and aromas in a way that we just haven't before. And we're learning all kinds of things about not just what makes things delicious, but what makes one thing remind us of another thing, and how to take the culinary traditions that time has given us, and with the benefit now of this understanding, deepen them and marry them and come up with new ways of giving ourselves pleasure.
I wholeheartedly agree. Harold, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us today about umami and about the science that underpins food and your journey through that world. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Johnny. It's been a lot of fun.